It's good to be here with you this morning. This morning, if you want to, go ahead and open up to 1 Kings chapter 3. That's where we're going to be taking a look. Again, that is 1 Kings chapter 3, as was the reading for us this morning. As we start into this lesson, let me give you an entirely separate verse that I would say would be a good theme verse for this text. And that verse comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18. And there, Paul writes, "Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise." It takes a certain amount of intellectual humility in order to gain wisdom. And that's exactly what we're going to get to see with Solomon when God asks what he can do for him. So we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to start out with a little bit of background that actually comes from chapter 2 of 1 Kings. So in 1 Kings chapter 2, in the first few verses there, we're going to set up a little bit of what's happening in chapter 3. It says, "Now the days of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong therefore, and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn." So David is at death's door when we see him in chapter 2 here. And he's giving his last words of wisdom to his son Solomon, who is about to take the throne, or at least so he's supposed to take the throne. After David's death, there's actually, in between that text and our text, a little bit of turmoil where his other son Adonijah tries to take the throne, and he's supported by some others, but he, as well as Joab, one of the commanders of David's army, ends up getting executed for their part in this treason. So that's all great stuff that's happening right after David dies, but whenever we get to chapter 3, we get to see the start of Solomon's reign. And Solomon, as we'll take a look at, starts out pretty early in his reign by having a diplomatic marriage to the Pharaoh's daughter. So that's the king of Egypt's daughter, and this marriage would be a diplomatic one, meaning it helps political ties between those two nations. And that's, of course, one of his many, many marriages that he will have. But possibly by her influence or by his own advisors or by other influences, Solomon is doing something wrong. And we see this as soon as we see this chapter open in Solomon's reign. In verse 3 of the text here, it says, "And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except..." It's kind of an important word there. He is following everything that David did except this one little thing, and it's not actually that little. Except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Now, that probably doesn't sound like much. It doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal, but there is an issue with this. Unsurprisingly, God is pretty specific about where he wants to be worshipped. And according to Leviticus chapter 17, verses 8 and 9, he is very specific. And of course, he does not want to be worshipped in certain places. Among them, at the top of the list, would be the high places. Now, what are those? Those high places are not just high points in the land of Israel, although they are high places, but they are specific places that altars were set up to pagan gods, the gods of the Canaanites before they took over the land. So that tradition has persisted even down to the days of Solomon, which is many hundreds of years past the time that they should have already been, or after they've conquered the land, and should have been no longer worshiping like the pagans did that were among them. But they continue this practice, and apparently even Solomon continues this practice. So he's worshiping on these high places, these pagan places, even though God has forbidden it. But still God, apparently seeing or giving some favor to Solomon, is willing to ask him an incredible question that we'll look at. And the question comes in verse 5. So Solomon is at Gibeon. He apparently is asleep. And in a dream by night, God asked him, "What shall I give you?" That is about the most backwards question that God could ask of man. Why would God ever ask us, what could I do for you? Now, certainly that's the question we should ask when we look to God. We should ask, well, what can I do for God? But God says, no, on the other hand, in Solomon's case here, Solomon, how can I help you? That just seems strange, but we can speculate reasons for it. I don't know if we have a great reason. It could be, as a lot of people suggest, that this is a test for Solomon. And maybe it is to an extent. It also could be, and is likely, that it is because Solomon will be leading God's people that he offers him this help. God wants his people to be led by quality individuals, people that are able to lead. And so God says, okay, if you're going to lead my people, let me give you something to do that. But you decide. So what does Solomon choose? Well, he starts out in verse 6 here by showing his praise to God. He doesn't immediately ask the favor, but he says to God in this vision, in this dream, he says, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness. He continues on to say that now I sit on this throne. So he says, it is a great blessing that you have allowed my father David to reign as long as he did, and now I'm taking up his throne. And that's a blessing I recognize as well. And he's showing his gratefulness to God for this. But then in verse 7, he says, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child, and I do not know how to go out or come in. Solomon is showing some humility before it ever gets to the point of having wisdom necessarily. Solomon is showing that he recognizes his own position, as I think most of us would. Imagine if someone came up to you today and said, you are now the president of the United States. Do you think that you are qualified for that job? I don't think I'm qualified for that job. I don't think most of us are qualified for that job. I don't know that anyone's really qualified for that job, but it would certainly be a difficult position to be put into, and that's the position of Solomon. He is thrust into this position of being king. He is young. We don't know exactly how young here, but he's a young man, and he says that I am but a child. Now, he's not that young, but he says, emotionally speaking, or in light of this situation, I am a child compared to the task that is at hand. That's Solomon's humility that he starts with, and then he makes then he adds to that actually in verse 8. Let's cover that real quick. Verse 8, he says, you've made your servant a king over a people that is too great to be numbered. What I find interesting with this is that Solomon doesn't ask for wisdom for himself, which shows a great deal of wisdom in and of itself. He doesn't say, God, could you make me wise so that I look good in front of everybody else? Could you make me wise so that I become the greatest king in history? He says, God, can you make me wise so that I can lead your people? He asked two specific things about wisdom. He asked for two specific things. We always say that Solomon asked for wisdom, and that's true. And God says a little bit later in the text that he'll give him a wise and understanding heart. I guess that's where we get the wisdom. But Solomon doesn't really ask for wisdom, not directly, but he asked for two things. Number one, Solomon asked for open-mindedness. When we look at verse 9, it says, therefore give to your servant an understanding heart. An understanding heart. Now, how does that translate to open-mindedness? Well, because the word understanding there more literally means, or the phrase would mean, a heart or a soul that listens. So Solomon asked God, would you give me a heart that listens? That takes a lot of wisdom to even know to ask for that. But he says, God, if I'm going to be a leader of your people, if I'm going to be a great leader and succeed in this task, I need a heart that listens to people. We get to see that later on in this chapter in the most famous judgment that Solomon makes between two women who have lost a child. And we remember the story. He suggests that a sword be brought to cut one of the other child in half and divide the child between the two women. Hopefully you know how the rest of the story goes. Otherwise, that just kind of sounds like a bad idea. But it shows Solomon's great wisdom that he has, and it shows that he has a heart that is willing to listen to both sides before making a decision. That's what he asked for. The other thing that he asked for is discernment. Discernment. He says, in addition to that, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? He asked for discernment between right and wrong. And it sounds like that would be such a simple thing. It sounds like Solomon is asking for basic morality, just a conscience to say, well, this is right, this is wrong. But he's asking for more than that, because he's asking from God. He's not just saying, well, I think I need to make the right choice, but he's saying, God, show me what is right. Well, what is right? What's right is whatever God has commanded him to do. What is right is whatever God's plan for him is, and what is wrong is anything else. He says, Lord, give me the wisdom to see the difference, to see your plan, to see your ideas, to see your wisdom instead of my own. It comes back to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18 that we said at the beginning. We have to become a fool in this age to become wise with God. That's what Solomon is willing to do. So, what happens? Let me suggest to you that the most important thing that comes from this is not the response of God where God gives him abundantly more than he asked for. That's kind of nice. He says, okay, you ask for wisdom, but I'll give you riches and power and glory and honor and all those things. That's not what's important. What's important is the very start of verse 10, where it says, the speech pleased the Lord. What Solomon said pleased God. There's nothing more important than that in life anyway, but certainly when it comes to wisdom, and when it comes to wisdom before God, the only wisdom we can have is to do what pleases him. It seems that Solomon already had a good amount of discernment, the ability to tell between right and wrong when he made this request, because God is pleased. It's the most that we can ask for. What is God pleased by here? I think he's pleased, if I can speak on behalf of God for this idea, I think he probably sees the humility and is pleased by that. He sees the desire that Solomon has to please God, and he sees the desire that Solomon has to be a faithful servant over God's people. Those three things allow God to say that he is pleased by what has happened. Now, of course, it goes beyond this in verse 11 to say that because you have asked for this and not for the easy things, because you didn't ask that all your enemies be defeated, because you didn't ask for riches and wealth, because you didn't ask for anything earthly, then you'll get those things as well. Let me suggest something to you, though, that God didn't just rain gold out of the sky for Solomon. He didn't just instantly fill his bank account with more money than he could possibly use, but that wealth actually took time to create. In Proverbs chapter 8, of course written by Solomon as well, in verse 21 it says, as it personifies wisdom as if it were a woman, and it says of her, that I, that is wisdom that I may cause those who love me to inherit wealth, and that I may fill their treasuries. The idea here is that wisdom, one of the natural results of wisdom, is wealth, is power. And that may seem strange to us, but if we would actually follow what Proverbs teaches about wealth, we would see a lot of that prosperity come to fruition. But Solomon doesn't just get wealth because God has said he will get wealth, but he gets wealth because he has gained the wisdom that God has chosen to give unto him after he has asked for it. So it's the wisdom that produces the wealth, not the other way around, and not that God just hands it to him. But it is part of the work that he does for it. So beyond this, though, in verse 14. In verse 14 it says, so if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Only then will I lengthen your days. The promise that God has made to Solomon to give him not only the wisdom that he asked for, but also the power and the wealth, that promise is conditional, as most of God's promises are. And the condition is that you keep those same statutes that David did. That doesn't seem like a lot, but fortunately none of us have ever had to keep the old law. It was a challenge to do so, and we've already seen that Solomon was failing at it before this situation ever occurred. But he says, if you're willing to do this, and if you will do this, then you will succeed, and you will be great. Now, of course, we know that Solomon's life does not pan out quite that way. We know that Solomon breaks this covenant that he makes with God 1,000 times over. God is merciful to him for a long time, but eventually the day of reckoning still comes even for Solomon. But let me suggest that Solomon does in fact get wisdom. Now, we can see that obviously in his writings, but I'm going to say that Solomon gets wisdom immediately. At least some wisdom. Obviously, wisdom takes time, but Solomon starts out pretty wise after this encounter. How do I know that? Well, remember back in verse 3, whenever we saw Solomon was following everything that David did, except that one thing where he was not supposed to worship on the high places, but instead was supposed to worship in Jerusalem. Verse 15. It says, then Solomon awoke, and indeed it had been a dream. As soon as he wakes up, it says, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord and offered up burnt offerings, offered up peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. How do I know the wisdom took effect? Because Solomon made the right choice as soon as he woke up. He'd been doing things close to right before, and now he's done everything right, at least for this time. So the wisdom has taken effect. But that wisdom over time gets better and better. It ages very well. And by the time that Solomon writes Proverbs, he writes the wisest collection of sayings that we have on earth. In Proverbs chapter 3, the best known passage, I imagine, from Proverbs, in verse 5, we get to see a text that is a great reflection on this text that we've just read. It serves as an example. This text in 1 Kings serves as a perfect example of what Solomon says in these verses. Proverbs 3, starting in verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Solomon understood, at least after asking from the Lord for wisdom, that this is what wisdom looks like. That wisdom begins, he says here, that it requires a certain amount of humility, of trusting the Lord with all your heart. That's what he does in this text. He says, okay, God, I'm not going to ask for my enemies to be no more. I'm not going to ask for you to remove all the difficulties in my life, but instead, I'm going to ask for wisdom and know that wisdom, your wisdom, will take care of me. Wisdom has to begin there with humility. They are integrally tied together. So what do we learn, though? Number one, this is the hardest part, I think, of this lesson, to say that we have to admit that we do not know everything. A lot of times we're even willing to say it, but we're not willing to believe it. It's very easy for us to think that we know everything, or at least more than someone else knows, or that we know enough that we don't need to listen to other people, that we know enough that we can't learn anything more about a certain subject. But in reality, we can always learn more. A few examples with this. Number one, we can learn something from everybody. Now, when we read the book of Proverbs, we are learning from the wisest man that's ever lived. We're learning from a great king. We're learning from a very important person. But when we read Proverbs, what is it that Solomon points to as an example of wisdom? He says, if you want to see wisdom in action, if you want to see hard work in action, turn to the ant. A small insect. He says, even from the humble ant, you can learn. Why? Because you don't know everything. and even an ant has something to teach you. So whether it's an ant or whether it's a great philosopher or a great king, we can learn from everybody. Now, of course, God is the wisest of all. And so when we look to God and we see that he has wisdom, and we look at this situation, we see that Solomon, all that he had to do was ask for wisdom. Then we are able to see James chapter 1 and verse 5 in action. In James chapter 1, verse 5, it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, as Solomon admitted that he did, and as we must admit that we do if we want to get wisdom, if I lack wisdom, all I have to do is ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. The first step, of course, in solving the problem is admitting that there is one. In this case, that we lack wisdom. That doesn't matter if you are 10 years old or if you are 100 years old. You lack wisdom. Isn't that fun to hear? I lack wisdom at any age that I am at. All of us lack wisdom. And we will lack wisdom until maybe the day that we arrive in heaven, and we'll have a much better understanding of a lot of things than we do now. But wisdom gives birth to more wisdom. Anytime that we are willing to show humility, as Solomon did, and if we are willing to say that we need wisdom, that's enough wisdom for us to gain all the more wisdom. A second part with this is in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 20, one of my favorite verses in Proverbs. But in verse 20 here, it says, listen to counsel and receive instruction. Why? Should you listen to counsel and receive instruction so that you'll be wise right now? So that you'll know everything immediately? No. But it says, listen to counsel and receive instruction that you may be wise in your latter days. There's some wisdom that just doesn't come without time. And as much as we can learn, as much as we should learn over the years, ultimately it will be a lifelong process, as it was for Solomon. He's not instantly wise for all things when this happens, but that wisdom will grow and grow over time. Now, this morning, for you individually, I'll ask you a question, or I'll rephrase a question that God has already asked to Solomon. And as amazing as it seems, God still asks the same question today. And the question is, what shall I give you? What shall I give you? If God came to you personally, if he came to you in a dream tonight, as he did to Solomon, and he said, what will I give to you? There's a lot of answers that we could give. There's a lot of answers we probably would give. Maybe we would say health. Certainly in this time right now, a lot of people are very focused on health, on their own health. So maybe we would say our health, or our family's health even, not just about us. Maybe we would say wealth, of course. Maybe we would say a long earthly life is what you can give me. Or maybe we would say that a life that is filled with ease, that's what we want. Or maybe a more admirable answer to the question is, God, can I have the promise of heaven without having to do anything else? Or could I just be in heaven right now? And you'd say, well, that's a pretty good answer, but the best answer that can be given, if God asks the question, what can I give to you? Wisdom enough to know God's word and God's will, and wisdom enough to be able to discern what is the right parts of his will, the righteous part of everything he tells us, to make a discernment between what is wrong in this world and following what is right that God tells us, to have the wisdom not of this world, but the wisdom of God. So God asks you this morning, what can I do for you? This is an opportunity to answer that question in whatever way that needs to happen. Whatever the answer is for you, this is the opportunity that you have to make a change. We're at the end of a year. A lot of times we focus on the next year. If next year's goal is to increase in wisdom, that's an admirable goal, and it's a very easy to accomplish goal if we're willing to put in just a little bit of work. This morning, God still asks the question, what can I do for you? What shall I do for you? And no greater wisdom exists than making yourself right with God this morning. If we can help you to do that, if we can help you in any way that you require, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.